This episode of the Audacity podcast is brought to you in part by GoToMeeting with HD Faces. Welcome to the Audacity to podcast, episode 100! 100 amazing podcasting tips. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Audacity to podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, and this is a how-to podcast about podcasting and using Audacity. It's where I give you the guts and teach you the tools to podcast with passion, organization, and dialogue. I cannot believe this is episode 100. When I first started the Audacity to podcast, I had a list of 36 episodes or somewhere around there, and I'm on episode 100. That is unbelievable to me, and I wanted to celebrate this 100th episode not by taking some boring walk down memory lane or anything about me. I want it to be about you, so that's why I've been putting out this call to podcasters asking for podcasting tips, and wow, there are some great tips that I'm going to share with you. 100 amazing podcasting tips from other podcasters. Now, I've inserted some of my own tips in here and there, because when I combined all of these together and started removing all of the duplicates, there were about a dozen or so duplicates, it left some slots. So I went ahead and inserted some extra tips in here, some things that I think might have been missing. But wow, there are some things here that I thought, wow, that's a great tip. There are some funny tips. There are some serious tips. There are some challenging tips in here. So I am so excited to share this with you. The 100th episode full of 100 amazing podcasting tips from you guys. So thank you so much for participating. Thank you for being a part of this. And thank you for listening for however long you've been listening to the Audacity podcast. But before I go on, I want to tell you about something that I believe in. I believe that to be successful in business, you really need to be able to meet with your team and clients and colleagues regularly, because otherwise you'll just be off somewhere in the distance and who knows what you're doing. But meeting regularly and helping other people in what they're doing is crucial. That way you can discuss plans, ideas. You can see these things really come to life. So with your clients and colleagues in different offices or traveling around or whatever, it's not very easy to meet face-to-face, which is the best way to do it. But if you have GoToMeeting with HD Faces, you can do it. It's powerfully simple and superbly high quality to meet online with clients, colleagues, and coworkers anywhere in the world with an internet connection. GoToMeeting with HD Faces gives you and your team this incredible ability to be able to meet just anywhere with an internet connection. If you have a webcam, especially an HD webcam, you can see each other face to face. You can share documents, anything like that, anywhere in the world. Even join meetings from mobile devices like an iPad. I use GoToMeeting in book clubs and meetings with clients and training times. It is fantastic, really easy. And you can try GoToMeeting free for 30 days. Don't wait. For this special offer, visit gotomeeting.com, click on the Try It Free button, and use the promo code PODCAST. Be sure to use the promo code PODCAST. And remember, GoToMeeting. Meeting is believing. And thank you so much, Citrix, for sponsoring this 100th episode of the Audacity to podcast. So here we go. In order to fit all of this stuff in, I can't comment on these wonderful tips. I really want to. So you're going to hear these tips again in the future. I'll just be here saying tip number 1, number 2, number 3, and then playing these tips or reading these tips as they came in. So here we go with 100 amazing podcasting tips, starting very appropriately with number 1.
This is Dave Jackson from the schoolofpodcasting.com, and my tip is start. You can plan it, you can think it, but eventually you just have to start, because in 10 episodes, 20 episodes, 30 episodes, nobody is happy with their first episode completely, because you always get a little better.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that. And then tip number 2.
Hey, Daniel, it's Cliff Ravenscraft from podcastanswerman.com, and I want to congratulate you on your 100th episode of the Audacity to Podcast. Awesome job, my friend. My number 1 tip that I love to give: stop obsessing about your stats. and instead focus on building a relationship with the audience you already have. Anyway, congratulations again, Daniel. Thank you so much for all that you do for the podcasting community.
Fantastic and time-tested advice. Tip number 3, and this is from me. Approach every interaction with gratefulness, even if it's an anonymous negative review. That's from Daniel J. Lewis, the Audacity podcast. Me. Tip number 4.
Hi, this is Max Flight. Before you start recording over Skype, run a Skype test to make sure that everything is working just the way you want it. You don't want to start that interview only to discover that there's some kind of a change to one of the settings that needs to be made, or your Skype is not configured the way you want it. So test it in advance. Just run a quick test and make sure everything is great.
Great advice, Max. Tip number 5 comes from Brad Bruce, who said, when picking music for your intro or outro music, consider your listener's environment and how it will sound where they're listening. Tip number 6.
John Wilkerson from the Wired Homeschool over at the wiredhomeschool.com with a podcasting tip. Be a copycat. That's right. Don't be afraid to copy what others have done. If someone has a good system or a good idea or a good topic, don't be afraid to copy that idea, but put your own special, unique twist on the topic.
Fantastic advice, John. Thank you very much. Tip number 7.
Hey, this is host Chiaki from the Japanese Metalhead Show and the Metal Moment podcast. The tip of the moment: shave before you record, because you don't want your stubbles rubbing against your nylon pop filter. Unless you're a gal. In that case, you're all good in the hood, yo.
Hilarious, but very good advice. Thank you so much, Chiaki. And tip number 8.
This is Ron Eastwood. If you find a particular phrase that you're saying far too often, take some time to create a list of alternatives to take that phrase's place and practice using them.
Useful advice. Thank you very much, Ron. Tip number 9.
Hi, I'm DJ City from the Japan Experience podcast, and I'm here to present my tip. Always use a pop filter. A pop filter is always good to have because, you want to get that nice sound. You don't want to be popping in people's ears.
Great advice, DJ, and very cheap to get or make, too. Tip number 10.
Hi, this is Dan from mu-podcast.com. My tip is that I carry around a small, pocket-sized, spiral-bound notebook and a pen. You can use it to jot down ideas for show topics, interview questions, notes, and sketching new website layouts.
Fantastic. Analog sometimes is better than digital. Thank you so much. Tip number 11.
This is Dave Jackson from the Grow Your Church Show, and whatever schedule you pick, whether it's weekly, daily, monthly, pick a schedule and stick to it. You're seen as reliable, and you have that reputation until you blow it.
Thank you so much, Dave. Tip number 12.
This is Tim from cornergeeks.com, and my tip is to use a hardware recorder, because one time I was using Audacity to record, and due to some high CPU utilization, the multi-track recording got out of sync, and it was a pain to actually fix it in post.
Thank you so much, Tim. Good advice, and I just recorded an episode about that, too. Tip number 13 comes from Byron Friday, who said, if you're new and lack confidence, do what actors do. Rehearse, and build your confidence. Tip number 14.
Hi, this is Max Flight. One tip is to get a second monitor. Instead of having all those scraps of paper and notes and printouts and things scattered about as you prepare and then start your recording session, get it all electronic. Get a second monitor so that you have a lot of screen real estate, and then you have the ability to sort of array everything in front of you where you can see it easily and you don't have to shuffle papers.
Great advice. Even consider a third monitor. Tip number 15 comes from me. I recommend put your pets somewhere that they won't disturb your podcasting. I have a dog. She barks sometimes. She gets out of the room when we podcast. Tip number 16.
John Wilkerson from the Wired Homeschool over at the wiredhomeschool.com with a podcasting tip for the Audacity to podcast. Take a break. Don't be afraid to not release a podcast 1 week or 2 weeks or for a month. Take that time to sit down, refresh yourself, relax, refocus, and plan for future podcasts.
Great advice, John. And sometimes breaks are needed too. And tip number 17.
This is Louise over at anonymousknitter.com. Go ahead and test out your show notes ahead of time. Go ahead and write a draft over at WordPress and test all your links, upload all your pictures. Thank you.
Great advice, Luis. And also WordPress has that handy preview button so you can see what it will look like before you publish. Tip number 18.
This is Dave Jackson from the Healing Our Marriage podcast. And while we all know content is king, the more podcasts you add, the less time you're going to have to find great content for each of those podcasts. So think twice before starting a second, third, and fourth podcast.
Great advice, Dave, who you're going to hear mention that he's from a different podcast every time. Tip number 19.
This is Kerry Green from the Christian Home and Family Podcast and ChristianHomeandFamily.com. I have a new piece of equipment. It's the Audio-Technica AT2005 USB Cardioid Dynamic USB XLR microphone. And as the name implies, it can do USB and XLR connections. I'm speaking to you on it right now, and it's under $100.
Fantastic quality, Kerry, and thank you so much for that recommendation. Tip number 20.
A tip from Max Flight. Don't assume that all the best gear means that you'll have the best podcast. If you have limited funds, focus on the essentials, but really devote your energy to audio quality and episode content.
Thank you for that good suggestion, Max. Tip number 21.
Hi, this is Craig from Making Business and Sales Work. This tip is don't be afraid of re-recording. I have dumped a 15-minute podcast because when I was listening back to it, I knew it was going to take longer to edit it than it was to re-record it. So just make good notes of all the mistakes you've made and just re-record it. It's not going to kill you.
Every time I've re-recorded an episode, I was glad I did. Thank you so much for that, Craig. Tip number 22.
This is Ron Eastwood. Be sure to visit the bathroom before you sit down for your recording session.
Very funny, but very practical too. Thank you, Ron Eastwood, for that. Tip number 23 came in from Parrot, who said, for beginner podcasters who want to practice with recording and audio editing before they get started, volunteer at LibriVox.org. I'll have that link in the show notes, by the way, at theaudacitypodcast.com/100. You get to help read public domain audiobooks that are distributed for free over the internet, and you can help practice and build your confidence. Thank you so much for that, Parrot. And then tip number 24 comes from me. If you want something from your listeners, ask for it often. Feedback, ratings and reviews, even donations. If you don't ask, they won't give it. Tip number 25.
John Wilkerson from the Wired Homeschool over at thewiredhomeschool.com with a podcasting tip. Join a podcasting network. Joining a podcasting network allows you to get in touch with other podcasters. That allows you to be mentored and to be a mentor. It also helps to promote your podcast as well because you'll have a network that works for you.
Fantastic advice, John. And I am a proud member of the Tech Podcast Network, and I'm bringing some new members on for the Noodle Mix Network too. Tip 26.
Max Flight with a tip here. If you have guests on your podcast, obviously the best way to communicate with them is over Skype. But one thing to never, ever try is a guest who's using a cell phone on a moving train. That's right, on a moving train. We've tried it. It doesn't work. Find another way or another guest.
Great advice, Max. I wonder even about any kind of on-the-move co-host, like on a cell phone while they're driving. Probably not a good idea either. Tip number 27.
Hi, this is Kerry Green from the Christian Home and Family Podcast and ChristianHomeandFamily.com. My podcasting tip is I use the free Skype recorder called MP3 Skype Recorder. Installs automatically into Skype, and when you open Skype, it automatically opens up, and you can set it to record automatically or not, and it does a pretty good quality for a free program.
Thank you for that suggestion, Kerry. I'll have a link to that in the show notes too. Tip 28.
Hey, Daniel. Wayne here with another podcasting tip for you. Remind everybody to please have a listener voicemail number and remind listeners of that number often.
Great advice, Wayne. Tip number 29.
It's Damien from the Australian Power Transmission Podcast with an Audacity tip for everybody out there, which is going to save you about half an hour of editing. and that is do not run the compressor before you truncate silence if you do so. I used to do that and wondered why it took me forever. Not anymore. Thanks, Daniel. Love the show.
Thank you, Damien, for that great Audacity tip. And then tip 30.
This is Dave Jackson from feedingmyfaith.com, and my tip is when you're choosing your show name, check to see if a domain name that matches your podcast name is available, and make sure it's something that's easily said and easily spelled. If you have to spell your domain name, pick another one.
Great advice, Dave. Tip 31.
This is Kevin Mulrine from yesmusicpodcast.com. My podcasting tip is, before you podcast, don't drink fizzy drinks. I've done that several times, and the effect is not appealing.
Unless you want burping in your podcast. Tip 32. That's from me. Don't use copyrighted music as your theme song unless you have written permission. Tip number 33.
John Wilkerson with the Wired Homeschool over at thewiredhomeschool.com. I've got a podcasting tip for the Audacity to podcast. If you're recording in an open area, don't be afraid of background noise. A little ambiance adds something to a podcast, especially if they know that you're on a convention floor or you're someplace else where background noise is expected. It adds character and charm to your podcast.
Thanks for that reminder, John. And then tip 34.
Max Flight here with a tip. Listen to your own podcast. That's right. A lot of podcasters don't. You can do that as a quality check, especially if you've done a lot of heavy editing to make sure that you don't embarrass yourself with a final recording that's got a defect in it. But also, you can listen for ways that you could improve the quality or the content next time.
Tip 35.
This is Dave Jackson from weeklywebtools.com, and if you have multiple people on your show, multiple hosts, sit down and draft up a piece of paper of what happens if somebody wants to leave or if somebody has a baby. Do you have to remove your episodes? How you're going to divide up money and things like that. Get it all in writing and set your expectations.
Thank you, Dave. That's great to do now before you think you need it. Tip 36.
This is Ron Eastwood. On days when you need to record and you're stuffed up, just a touch of horseradish or hot pepper can really clear you up for a short time.
Wow, I'd never thought of that before, but thank you very much for that, Ron. Great advice there. Tip 37 came from me again. Write short, compelling episode titles that convey some of what the episode is about. Don't just make it episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. Make it compelling that people will want to listen to it from the title. Tip 38.
Hi, Daniel. This is Steve Stewart from the Money Plan SOS podcast, and my tip for you is I have previous guests and even some loyal subscribers call in or use SpeakPipe or something and get me an audio file that follows a simple script, and it goes like this. It says, "Hi, this is so-and-so from such and such, and you're listening to Steve Stewart on the Money Plan SOS podcast, helping everyday Americans to pay attention, not interest." And what that does is it shows some community and some social juice, and it helps them promote their website as well.
That's a great way to involve your listeners. Thank you so much, Steve. And tip 39.
Hi, Daniel. This is Matthew Lowell from the Awaken Revolution podcast at awakenrevolution.com. Turn the fan off in the room and get those towels to sop up that nasty sweat because you know us podcasters sweat for our art, right?
Thank you. Tip 40.
Max Flight here with a tip. Don't allow your computer programs to auto-download updates. You can be sure that in the middle of a recording session, some giant update will start, eat up all your bandwidth, and there you go. Also, you might want to boot up well in advance, so if there are any programs out there that are going to do this, they'll be completed before you start your recording session.
Great advice, Max. Also, watch out for the automatic uploads, like backups. Tip number 41.
Hi, Daniel. John Dumas here, entrepreneuronfire.com, and I love your idea for 100 tips for your 100th episode. Here's my tip. When you're producing an interview-based podcast, make sure to always set your interviewees' expectations on the following 3 items: the content to be discussed, the time they need to set aside for the interview, and the general makeup of the audience they are speaking to. Congrats on the big 100, Daniel.
Thank you so much, John. Those are some great things to communicate to your interviewees. And tip number 42.
Hi, Daniel. This is Matthew Lowell from the Awaken Revolution podcast at awakenrevolution.com. My tip is very simple. Make a checklist and read it before every podcast. Some of the things on my checklist are: don't talk over one another, slow down and articulate your words, because we have a tendency to talk really fast if you know what I'm saying.
Again, great advice for if you're interviewing people, especially if they're not new to your podcast, but also regular co-hosts too. And tip 43.
John Wilkerson from the Wired Homeschool over at the wiredhomeschool.com with a podcasting tip for the Audacity to podcast. Don't sweat the small stuff. When you're just starting out, there's going to be some things that aren't just right about your podcast. That's okay. Don't worry about it. Just concentrate on fixing some of the larger problems with your audio and your workflow, and the small stuff will take care of itself.
Great reminder, John, and we were all newbies at this at some point or another. Tip number 44.
Hi, this is Max Flight. Consider using a soundboard app or program for your intros and outros and any pre-recorded messages and things of that sort. If you use a mixer, consider using your tablet or your smartphone or that sort of a thing as a soundboard.
Great advice, Max. Tip number 45.
This is Ron Eastwood. For a video podcast, you can have a shot that is of the upper half of your body, and then to create the illusion of multiple cameras, copy that footage into another track, then crop it up to a little bit more like your head and shoulders, and you have a second video track. Then you can switch between the two tracks and even add in a screen capture track.
Very creative, Ron. Thank you for that tip. Tip 46 comes from me. I'd suggest that you be as unique as possible, as quickly as possible in your podcast opening. Don't make your opening any longer than 30 seconds. And then tip 47.
This is Craig from Making Business and Sales Work. Be honest with your audience. Give them something of yourself. Give them something to connect with. Don't try to be someone you're not. Don't try to come across with some great new persona. Just be yourself.
Great advice, Craig, and a great reminder to us when we're especially starting out and trying to find ourselves in podcasting. Tip 48.
This is Max Flight. Another tip is to record your episodes to an uncompressed file format like WAV. And throughout the entire post-production process, keep everything uncompressed. Only convert to MP3 is the absolute last step.
Fantastic suggestion, Max. Thank you. Tip number 49.
Hi, I'm DJ City from the Japan Experience podcast, and I'm here to present my tip. Use a USB mic or use a USB connection to your computer because they give you the best sound possible.
Great, and so much better than analog mics and connections, too. So much freer of noise. Thank you for that, DJ. And tip number 50. We're halfway there, folks.
This is Dave Jackson from the Logical Weight Loss Podcast, and my tip is when you're starting a podcast, avoid free hosting. In the end, you're going to want to move. Trust me on that. And in the same way that it's no fun to move in real life, it's no fun to move digitally.
Exactly right. Everything comes with a price. Even if it's free, it costs you in some way. So thank you so much, Dave. Tip 51.
Hi, Daniel. This is Mike Russell from musicradiocreative.com. My tip is to forward promote what's coming up later on in the podcast to keep your listeners listening until the end, and also to tease what's coming up in the next episode so they come back for more.
Great advice, Mike. And this goes back to have a plan for your podcast so you do know what will be coming up. Tip number 52.
Hi, this is Max Flight with a tip. If you are supposed to have a regular schedule for your podcast, stick to it, because loyal listeners come to build their schedule around you. But especially if you're weekly or even daily, it's something that you need to recognize. If your routine doesn't match your listeners' routine, they'll leave you.
Good reminder, Max. Get consistent with your stuff. Tip 53 comes from me. I recommend make your show notes contain every link, image, quotation, product, or video that you mention in your podcast. So when people go to your site, they can find what they're looking for without having to try and find it through all of your audio or video that you shared. Tip 54.
John Wilkerson from the Wired Homeschool over at the wiredhomeschool.com with a podcasting tip for the Audacity to podcast. Cooperation. That's right, cooperation. Team up with other podcasters on podcasts, covering topics, and even promoting one another. You're in it together. Leverage other podcasters, and all of you will benefit from it.
Great reminder, John. And you can hear many of my, quote, competitors are in this episode, and we're very happy to submit their tips, and I am so thankful for that. Tip number 55.
Hi, Daniel. This is Eileen from the Miss Eileen Speaks podcast. First, I want to say congratulations on your 100th episode. And my tip is, podcasters, please state your name and the name of your podcast at the beginning of your episode.
Good reminder, because our listeners might not know who we are if they're just joining us. Tip number 56.
Hi, this is Carl Valair with Aviation Careers Podcast. My tip is to share your show notes with the person you're going to interview before your podcast by sending them a PDF file. A PDF file can be read by just about anybody in the world.
Great tip, Carl. Tip number 57.
Hi, a tip from Max Flight. Help other podcasters when they ask you for help. It'll make you feel good to pay it forward, but doing this also has the result of honing your own skills, because you have to learn something well before you can teach it to others.
Great advice. Go teach something out there. Go help someone else. And Max is certainly doing that, helping many other people with podcasting too. Tip 58.
Hi, I'm DJ City from the Japan Experience podcast. My podcast tip is not to over-edit. This means if you go into your sound and you try to take out air that's there, don't over-edit your podcast, because if you do, you might end up with a word that rambles on and goes on and on and on without break. And it's really hard for people to follow.
Yes, we breathe for a reason, and it's beneficial to our listeners too. Tip 59.
Hi, Daniel. My name is Sabrina. My podcast is at thespline.com, and my tip is about editing. When you go through and write down all the timestamps for everywhere you need to edit, when you go back, make sure you start at the end and work your way forward. I did this the wrong way the first couple of times and realized very quickly that the times change after you change the first couple ones if you start at the beginning.
Good reminder, and that makes editing so much easier and so much quicker too. Tip 60, I recommend that you notify your listeners far in advance for any kind of time-sensitive items approaching. This could be if you are going to speak at a conference, if you are submitting your podcast and podcast awards, which today, by the way, is the last day to nominate the Audacity to Podcast and our others. Go to the audacitytopodcast.com/podcast awards if you want more information on that. Let them know ahead of time that it's coming so you can start getting them involved before the deadline hits. Tip 61.
John Wilkerson with the Wired Homeschool over at thewiredhomeschool.com. If you have to record in a noisy hotel, hide under the blankets. That's right, if you hide under the blankets, a lot of that noise from the other rooms and from the road outside won't be picked up as much from your microphone. So pull that blanket over your head and record your podcast.
This works very well. Just remember to fix your hair before you go out in public again. Tip 62.
Hey, Daniel, Wayne Henderson here from the Fringe Casting Podcast with a podcasting tip of don't drink milk or beer shortly before recording a podcast.
Great advice. That can really mess with your throat if you try and do that stuff. And Wayne would know since he's a voiceover guy. Tip 63.
Here's a tip from Max Flight. Treat your listeners with respect. When they write you, they've spent their own time. They've given up their own time. And because they've written you, you know that they're engaged in your podcast or whatever the online activity is that you're involved in. So give them the respect they deserve and reply.
Great tip, Max. Tip 64.
Hi, this is Kerry Green from the Christian Home and Family Podcast and ChristianHomeandFamily.com. This podcasting tip is that when you are doing recordings on Skype, do everything in your means to use a hardwired connection to your modem rather than wireless through your laptop. Hardwire is the way to go. See ya.
Thank you for that tip, Carrie. That works all the time. Hardwired is so much better than the wireless connection of any kind of wireless connection, no matter how fast it is. Tip 65.
Hi, Daniel. This is Mike Russell from musicradiocreative.com. My tip is to use intro music and jingles to brand your podcast and give it a unique sound. Well done on the 100th episode, and keep up the good work. I hope I can get to 100 myself one day. This is Mike Russell from musicradiocreative.com.
Thank you, Mike. Your music definitely brands your podcast, so pick something also that's unique and no one else is using, or almost no one else is using. Tip 66.
This is Craig from Making Business and Sales Work. A technique I was given by a guy who sings in a rock band is get the gain on your microphone down and get in close and talk to it. It stops you from getting too much room noise, echo, and those sorts of things. You could even wrap a small box around your microphone, put some T-shirts or a jumper inside it. It'll make it a nice dead sound. Get your gain down and get close to your mic.
Great advice, Craig. That even works on the internal microphones of computers. Just get closer and turn that gain down. Tip 67.
Max Flight with a tip here. If there's an event you could attend in your niche, don't be shy about it. Become the press and enjoy the access that it grants you. Request press credentials, attend, and capture content that would be difficult to get otherwise. As a member of the media, you can record some amazing interviews.
That's a great advice, Max, and I've used that before too. Tip 68.
This is Ron Eastwood. Have notes prepared before you begin recording. Even a rough outline can help you to get back on track when your thoughts get derailed.
Definitely helpful. It doesn't have to be word for word, but just that rough outline can help so much. Tip 69.
Hello, Daniel Lewis. This is Grant Swain from the Automotive Educators Podcast. The Dog Catcher app for Android is a great mobile podcast aggregator. It is a highly configurable, full-featured app for audio or video. It has all the features you would expect, and then more.
Thank you, Grant, for that suggestion. I've heard a lot of people recommend the Dog Catcher app for Android. Tip 70.
This is Mark from the Recovered Podcast at recoveredcast.com. Daniel, congratulations on your 100th episode of the Audacity to Podcast. I recommend that show notes be prepared well in advance and are as complete as possible. I try to forward these notes to my co-host a few days before we broadcast. We never talk about the show content until we're actually podcasting. This seems to keep it fresh and lively.
A common phrase with some of my podcast co-hosts is, save it for the podcast. Great advice, Mark. Thank you very much. Tip 71.
Hello, this is Lampros from the Penguin Producer with a tip for the 100th episode of the Audacity to Podcast. The truncate silence tool is a godsend for shrinking dead air, but be careful not to remove too much silence. Words before and after the pause tend to sound different than if there's no pause. Use a minimum duration of 1.5, or better yet 2 seconds, and your podcast, while shorter, will still flow realistically.
Great tip, Lampros, and that works so much in things that really require that timing, like comedy is so much built on timing. Tip 72 comes from me. I suggest make a professional sounding email address like feedback@myawesomepodcast.com instead of a Gmail or even something worse as your email address, even if that email address just forwards to your personal account. Tip number 73.
Hey Daniel, this is Jeremy Sarber from the Discovering Grace podcast, as well as the Tech Help for Churches podcast. Both can be found on jeremysarber.com or in iTunes. As a listener, I wish every podcaster would make their podcast RSS feed readily available on their website.
Great reminder, Jeremy. And if that isn't on there, then it can make people so much more complicated, or make things so much more complicated to subscribe. So thank you, Jeremy, for that reminder. And Wayne Henderson also sent in that as a reminder as well. Tip 74.
John Wilkerson from the Wired Homeschool over at thewiredhomeschool.com with a podcasting tip. Remember to use some chapstick or other kind of lip balm right before you podcast. This can help reduce that lip smacking noise that occurs every once in a while, especially once your mouth gets dry. So some lip balm or some chapstick will really help reduce those lip smacking noises.
That's something we so often miss in our podcasting, and especially if we're getting close to the microphone. That's very important. So thank you, John. Tip 75.
Hi, this is Max Flight. When you mess up in a way that your listeners feel it, and you will sooner or later, acknowledge it, but don't dwell on it. Nobody likes to hear excuses. Mention it if you feel you must. Figure out how to keep it from happening again, and then move on.
Great advice, Max. And tip 76 comes from Nick from Who Day Weekly podcast from spnt.tv. He said, podcast your passion. You'll be amazed at how easy it is to produce episodes if you simply podcast something you're passionate about. From sports teams to video games, podcast something that excites you. Thank you so much, Nick. And he is definitely excited by sports because that's what he podcasts about. And tip 77.
This is Kevin Mulrine from yesmusicpodcast.com. My podcasting tip is when you change, like I did, from a USB microphone to an analog one, don't forget that you'll need to switch off all mobile phones in the vicinity. Otherwise, you'll get that annoying bleeping sound constantly as you try and record.
Good reminder, especially if you have certain carriers like AT&T, they tend to cause that a little bit more. Tip 78.
This is Louise over at anonymousknitter.com. My tip is to write your show notes well before your episode and do your recording from your show notes.
That's fantastic because it really helps you to even out what you're going to talk about before you talk about it, and then it lets you publish your episode much quicker. Thank you, Louise. Tip 79.
My name is Tim from cornergeeks.com, and my tip is to actually monitor your hardware recording output, because there was one time where I recorded an entire podcast and there was a buzz in the background because I wasn't monitoring it.
Great tip, Tim. Get some headphones on to listen to yourself while you're recording. Tip 80.
Hi, this is Max Flight with another tip. Always create a backup recording if you can when you're recording your episodes, especially the longer episodes and especially those episodes with guests that were hard to score. Even if it's not quite as up to your usual standards, it's not the highest quality backup recording, at least you'll have something if disaster strikes.
And disaster does strike sometimes. Not all the time. Sometimes. Tip 81.
This is Ron Eastwood. Keeping hydrated will keep your voice from getting raspy. Make sure to drink 8 ounces of water within the hour before you begin recording, and keep a water bottle handy during recording.
Great advice. And I've heard someone recommend not cold or hot water, but just room temperature or lukewarm water too. Thank you, Ron, for that tip. Tip 82.
John Wilkerson with the Wired Homeschool over at thewiredhomeschool.com. I've got a podcasting tip for the Audacity to podcast, and that's don't be afraid to experiment. Try a different microphone, try a different mix, but don't make too many changes at one time so that you can back out and go back to the sound that your audience is used to.
Great advice, John. Thank you very much. Tip 83 comes from me. Tweet about your podcast episodes several times in a week, but write a different message and post it at different times and on different days. Tip 84.
This is Segovia Smith from audiospeedlearning.com, and my tip is to make a sign to hang on your front door that says, "Recording in progress. Please leave all packages at the door."
Great advice, especially if you're expecting a package. I've had doorbells interrupt recordings before. Tip 85.
Hey, Daniel, this is Wade Wingler from Fathers Over 40 podcast at fathersover40.com. Congratulations on 100 episodes. My tip is visualize your audience. To make things more conversational, before I hit the record button, I try to envision my audience listening to the show.
Great advice, Wade. Thank you so much for sending that in. Tip 86 comes in from Eric Fisher at beyondthetodolist.com, and he said, your voice is as valid as everyone else's. Don't let inner negative voices keep you from starting. Great reminder, Eric. Thank you so much. And thanks for being a part of Noodle Mix Network. Tip 87 comes from Byron Friday. He says, offer a way to subscribe to your podcast by email, like with FeedBurner. Great advice, great reminder. Many people like to receive these things by email. Tip 88.
Hey, Daniel, this is Brian at the PB&J Network, found at pbnjnetwork.com. Just have a co-host who likes to fidget, have them hold a stuffed animal. You can fidget with a stuffed animal all they want. It's soft. It doesn't make any noise. And as long as they're not touching the microphone or the microphone stand with the animal, it works really well.
Great advice, Brian. It may look silly, but yes, it does work well. Tip 89.
Hi, this is Max Flight. To speed up your workflow, use as many templates as possible. Use templates for your show notes. Use templates for your audio files, for example, your intro, your outro, the music, and just think of the things that you do in a repetitive fashion and use as many templates as you can so you don't have to do them over again each time.
Great advice, Max, because we often don't remember where we can make those templates and reduce repetitive steps. Tip 90 comes from me. Focus. Don't let things distract you or your audience from the content that you want to share and that they want to hear. Tip 91.
This is Craig from Making Business and Sales Work. One thing you should do as a podcaster is reach out to other podcasters. The Bunker Project in Canada talks about social media and black beer during their show, and they jokingly said, if anybody wants to send us a beer, feel free. So I boxed up 2 beers and sent it from Australia all the way to Canada. I got mentioned on their show nearly every week for 2 years. I have an audience now in British Columbia and parts of North America just because I contacted them and sent them a few beers. I've recorded this stuff for Daniel. It's a reach out to another podcaster. We're a small community. We should all stick together.
Great advice, Craig, and a great way to grow your audience as well. Tip 92.
Hi, Daniel. It's Steve Stewart from the Money Plan SOS podcast, and I have a video podcasting tip. Whenever I do screen capturing, like a tutorial, I always have my computer do the screen capturing of the external monitor that's off to my right. That way, I can still look at my notes that are on my normal laptop screen, and I can use the webcam that's built in or a webcam that's right there. But then it also appears as if I'm looking at the same thing they'll be looking at once I import the 2 videos together.
Great advice, Steve, especially good if you're doing those screencasts. Tip 93.
Hello, this is Louise over at anonymousknitter.com. My first tip is to have more information that you are going to include in your podcast than you actually will need to use. That way, if you need filler time, you've got extras you can include in your podcast.
Great idea, Luis. And also consider maybe your podcast doesn't need to be as long as you thought it did, but you might have to fit it to a certain length. Whatever your case is. Thank you so much, Luis. Tip 94.
This is Max Flight. If your guest or co-host on Skype or on the phone has the ability to also record the conversation, have them do that. Using this double ender technique will help make your audio quality the best it can be.
Good idea, Max. Tip number 95.
This is Dave Jackson from Building a Better Dave, and one thing you want to be cautious about is talking about your family in your podcast, because not everybody wants their live broadcast out to the world.
Ouch. Good reminder. Hopefully Dave hasn't suffered from that. Hopefully you haven't either. 96 comes from Nick from Who Day Weekly at spnt.tv. He said, do not get discouraged by feedback, whether it's a lack of feedback or bad feedback. Just because people aren't emailing you doesn't mean they don't enjoy your show. Great reminder, Nick. It's so easy to think that we're all alone and not realize how many people enjoy us, but just don't say anything. Tip number 97.
Hi, Daniel. This is Matthew Lowell from the Awaken Revolution podcast at awakenrevolution.com. Also have your special guests sign talent releases.
Great reminder, Matthew, because those talent releases are very important and you need that stuff in writing legally and all of that. Tip number 98.
Hey, Daniel, Wayne Henderson here, and my podcast tip would be, if you want more folks to listen, like me as well as others, do not use Blog Talk Radio.
Thanks, Wayne. Tip number 99.
Ben Avery here from the Strangers and Aliens podcast, strangersandaliens.com. And my advice comes not from something you've said, Daniel, but from something I've observed of you. And that is to be yourself. As a podcaster, you just need to be who you are. Your audience will appreciate your honesty. You have something worth saying. Don't try and be something different just because you have an audience or a microphone in front of your face. Thanks for the last 100 episodes, and preemptive thanks for the next 100.
Thank you so much, Ben, for sending that tip in. And tip number 100, the last one, comes from me. Work on your show notes regularly before your episode. It will make big outlines like this one very simple if you work on it ahead of time and regularly. That way you can add your stuff as you receive it and simplify your life so much better for your podcasting. So awesome job, everyone. Thank you so much for these amazing podcasting tips. And you've heard a lot of different web addresses, podcast names, people names, and all of that in this. And please go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/100 to check out the show notes for this episode. I'll have the complete list of all 100 of these tips there, as well as everyone's names and the links to their podcasts or their shows, their websites, whatever that they sent me. So go check that out at theaudacitytopodcast.com/100. And thank you so much for making this such an amazing 100th episode. And it's amazing because of what you shared as a listener. Now, here's the thing. If you're thinking, oh man, I missed the 100th episode. I know there are people out there thinking that because I've received emails from some people that said, I'm going to send you some tips. And they didn't get them in to me before I was recording today. So if you missed the opportunity to send your tip in, then please still send in a podcasting tip, because here's something I'm going to start doing on the Audacity to Podcast. Well, a couple things in the near future. One is I'm going to incorporate your podcasting tips when I can share them and then comment on them a little bit and maybe give some little how-tos and such. So you might hear some of these tips again, and you have an opportunity to send some of your tips in still that can be incorporated into this new segment I'll have on the Audacity to Podcast. And also, I'm going to start doing some more video stuff, showing you how to do these things instead of just describing them. Don't worry, though. I will still have the audio format where you'll be able to listen to things, but then there will be the video format also on some episodes, not all of them. You've seen it already where I've done some of this, but some video format stuff where you'll be able to see what I'm describing and see what it looks like and hear and all of that stuff. So that and so much more is coming at theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thank you so much to everyone who joined in the live show for this. I do this podcast live every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's GMT -4 while we're in daylight saving time, that is. And we've got in the chat room Nick and several names I can't pronounce, and DJ City, Ben, RC, the Koibi, Maddie Lowe, John Wilkerson, Awaken Revolution, and several anonymouses in there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Cowboy, that's how it's pronounced, not some odd thing. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. And I hope that you, if you haven't been able to join me for a live show, that you will join me again when I record this podcast again live on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time at noodle.mx/live. Send your feedback, ideas, questions for future episodes, your podcasting tips, and all of that to feedback at theaudacitytopodcast.com. You can also call in to 903-231-2221 and leave a message on the voicemail any time of day or night. Or you can go to theaudacitytopodcast.com and click on the Send a Voice Message tab over on the right side and record a message right from your computer. Be sure you go to the show notes for this episode of theaudacitytopodcast.com/100. Check out all of these awesome podcasts that everyone is doing and thank them for being a part of this episode. And today is the last day, October 15th, 2012, to submit nominations for the Podcast Awards. If you're listening to this and it's still October 15th, 2012, please go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/podcast awards and nominate our several podcasts in Noodle Mix Network in the awards. And voting starts on November 1st. So watch out for which of your favorite podcasts make it into the nominations so you can vote for them. Now that you have given us some of the guts and you have taught us some of the tools, it's time for us to go podcast with passion, organization, and dialogue. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. Follow me at twitter.com/theramennoodle. Thank you so much for listening and participating in this 100th episode. Thank you. The Audacity to Podcast is a proud member of Noodle Mix Network. Find more of our podcasts to make you think, laugh, and succeed at noodle.mx. You can laugh with our clean comedy, learn how to be productive in your personal life from beyond the to-do list, discover the secrets of Once Upon a Time TV show, and so much more at noodle.mx. The Audacity to Podcast is also a proud member of the Tech Podcast Network. If it's tech, it's here. Find more at techpodcast.com and watch for the awesome live CES coverage coming in January. That'll be at techpodcast.com.